actual presentation. So Franco, great, your webcam's up. I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thank you, Beth, and welcome everybody to the May 2020 version of Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities. My name is Franco Montalto, and I'm a professor here at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and one of the co-investigators in CC-RUN, the Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast. And so going back till 2014, we've had these monthly seminars, generally called Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities, where we focus on a broad range of topics about how cities are confronting the climate crisis. This is our first all-virtual webinar. Usually we have an in-person attendance as well as online attendance. This webinar, as well as all of our previous webinars, is recorded and posted to YouTube and also the CC-RUN website, and you can go back to hear any of our previous webinars by going to the CC-RUN website. The format is typically 2 to 3 or 1 to 3 speakers each month. It's the first Wednesday of every month, starting at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're usually in person, as I said. This is the first one that is completely online. For those of you who may be professional engineers, we do offer a continuing education credits for your attendance today. There is a certificate of completion that we can issue to you if you put your name in the chat box. My colleague Corinne will note that down, and we will be able to electronically send you your certificate of completion. So today's topic is moving from adaptation planning to implementation and back. Understanding how best to implement local climate resiliency strategies in a flexible, interconnected, and iterative way. And this month we have 2 speakers. Dr. Bill Solecki from Hunter College, who's a professor in the Department of Geography, will be our first speaker. Bill is also the co-founder of the Urban Climate Change Research Network. And Dr. Lisa Dilling, who is the director of the Western Water Assessment and associate professor of environmental studies in Colorado. So before I introduce Bill, who will be our first speaker, I'd like to introduce for some welcoming comments, our acting director of the NOAA RISA program. So CC-RUN is a RISA, Western Water Assessment is a RISA, and that's Chelsea Combest-Friedman. Chelsea previously worked with the Wildlife Conservation Society and USAID Environment and Development Program in Madagascar. She managed the Flora and Fauna International Regional Marine Portfolio in Latin America and the Caribbean, and her interests are broad and include understanding the human dimensions of change and supporting local actors. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Chelsea.
Great, thanks Franco. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. I just wanted to give a couple more minutes of sort of context for those that might be less familiar with the RISA program, as we've got our 2 speakers either being a lead or co-lead for 2 of the RISA teams that we have across the United States. So RISA stands for Regional Integrated Science and Assessments, and it's a program that's managed out of NOAA. The network overall includes 11 regional research teams that are located across the United States, and each of which carry out sort of a mix of interdisciplinary climate research and engage with decision makers to help connect science and decision making to advance climate adaptation in those regions. And so within the RISA network, there's sort of a number of applied social scientists and interdisciplinary scientists that do social science in an integrated way. And a couple years back, we were looking for a way to sort of help connect that sort of sub-network or community within the RISA network. And last year, we began some discussions within that sub-network to think about ways that we could share and learn from each other, as well as connect maybe with others that are in the climate adaptation field to consider questions or approaches that social scientists in this space are grappling with. And so the concept for this particular webinar actually has come out of those discussions, and we're hoping that in the future we can find other ways, whether through webinars or other mechanisms, to keep the dialogue going. Thanks very much, Franco.
Great. Thanks so much, Chelsea. And thanks for all your support in the RESA program. So everyone, welcome. Let's get started. We want this to be an opportunity for you to hear from the speakers, but also to engage with one another and share your own experiences and best practices. That's what makes the discussion rich and interesting. So we'll be hearing from our two presenters today and bring our panelists out to take questions after each of the presentations. So you'll have opportunities to interact with them individually and as a group. After the first presentation, we'll also be posting 2 questions to the audience, and we'll have you respond through the chat boxes that you see to the left, or in those questions you'll see them to the right. And you can ask and discuss with each other. We'll then take some time to discuss your experiences. First, though, I'd like to turn it back over to Corinne, who will help us learn more about you all, about our audience today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Franco, and thanks, everyone, for joining. I see some of you already entered your answers into the poll. So we have 2 poll questions for you today. And if you can't see the poll, you can enter your answers into the chat box on the left of your screen. So our first question today is, what employment sector do you work in? Federal government, state government, local, academia, business, industry, nonprofit, or other? And our second question is, are you engaged in the following with regards to adaptation? Vulnerability assessment, developing plans or policies, designing and implementing projects and initiatives, monitoring and performance measures, evaluating adaptation measures, conducting research, learning and revising adaptation efforts, or none of the above yet. So you should start to see the results on your screen, and it's amazing how varied it is, like pretty equally varied across all sectors and adaptation efforts that people are working on. So far, it looks like we have the most representation from academia, though we do have quite a bit of representation from government, all sectors, federal, state, and local. In terms of adaptation, it looks like quite a significant amount are working on developing plans and policies, as well as conducting research, though we do have good representation in each of the buckets, so that's really great to hear. Everyone's working on everything. All right, great. Well, I think it looks like we got quite a bit of results in, so thank you for participating. So we'll turn it back over to Franco and get the presentations underway. Thanks for participating.
Great. Thanks so much, Corinne. And I just want to note, we have really record turnout today. We have 96 participants, plus the 5 of us, the organizers, so we're over 100 people here. So these numbers are, this is a really interesting sort of cross-section and sampling of folks. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Bill Solecki, who's a professor in the Department of Geography at Hunter College, as I said before. Hunter College is part of the City University of New York. Bill is also the co-founder of the Urban Climate Change Research Network, sometimes referred to as UCERN or UCCRN. His research focuses on urban environmental change, resilience, and adaptation transitions. So the format is we'll hear from Bill, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions after the presentation. So as Bill is speaking, please type your questions into the chat box, and I'll be trying to kind of organize them in a way. And with that, we will, and then after Bill's done talking, we'll have an opportunity to interact with him about his thoughts. So with that, I'll hand it over to Bill, and I will dim my camera.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Franco. And thanks for all the attendees coming into the meeting. As was noted, the title of this today's panel touches on a kind of a critical question for us. The community looking at resilience and adaptation, that as practice, as concept moves to practice, there is an emerging set of questions regarding how successful some of these practices are, how to understand that level of success, and what the implications are for the long-term efficacy of these sorts of efforts. So that was sort of some of the root background. And what I want to do is just sort of go through some of that discussion, talk about how that process has taken place, and then from concept to practice, talk about some of these emerging challenges and opportunities, and then really sort of highlight some of the social science questions which are really emerging. I think certainly in the climate science domain, the physical science issues, the questions of future projections, current forecasts, et cetera, are key. But within that, as we start to sort of connect with different audiences as plans get implemented, there's also a clear need and opportunity for social science, and that's sort of part of this struggle that we're talking about. So one of the things that we'll also try to do is to sort of give some examples of things that have come out of the RESA program and some of the initiatives that both Lisa and myself have been able to work on. So in terms of this sort of concept to practice process, many of us are sort of engaged with these issues, and as I sort of stated, a kind of an overarching element to the discussion today is going to be some of these kind of phrases and terms and concepts which have emerged with respect to implementation. One is this idea of enabling conditions, how to sort of move the process forward. What are some opportunities that we've identified, the key things? Measures of success or metrics of success. How do we define success in these contexts? And the other thing that's really critical, this is item 3, is that, of course, resiliency efforts have to be embedded or connected to other questions of quality of life in the community in which these efforts are connected. And those are both, in some ways, accelerating processes of acceptance and adoption, in other cases, sort of slowing that process. We have to be key to that. And then the other sort of more broad umbrella is the sort of iterative process where we're connecting monitoring, evaluation, reporting, and learning in this sort of reflexive and iterative process, and how that helps adaptation as well. So these are sort of the threads that we're looking at. So if we look at this issue of adaptation as a process, there are many diagrams that sort of look like this. This is actually a fairly well kind of specified one. It's read from top to bottom with all the different components, things of impacts, adaptation, analysis, and then sort of implementation. And some of these words that I've just been using, sort of the enablers, the success, effective monitoring, and sort of the implications for community are kind of embedded in these diagrams, but they really, heretofore really haven't been sort of brought up more concretely in a lot of these diagrams. Some of the other efforts are starting to look at adaptation not just in sort of the linear pattern. Of course, we have the adaptation wheel sort of model, but really we recognize that adaptation as a process is one that is kind of circular in the sense that the process and the implementation of it then feeds back into sort of the societal context. This is sort of kind of an academic kind of phrasing, but it really starts to play out in terms of critical areas of concern with respect to practice, both in terms of the enabling conditions and the sort of implementation, which has that sort of monitoring, evaluation, reporting, and learning process, and then the capacity to how that sort of feeds back into the local community in the context. So these are sort of the real things that we want to kind of focus on here. Of course, a lot of cities, some of my work has been connected to the city of New York, and some of you might be familiar with these efforts. A lot of cities throughout the northeast of the United States and sort of nationally have developed a variety of adaptation plans and resiliency efforts, and this is sort of one that the city has certainly focused on, creating, among other components of a plan, of a sustainability plan, a resilient city set of initiatives that focus on neighborhoods, on buildings, on infrastructure, and in this case, a key target area of, in terms of coastal defenses. And so with that, there's a set of initiatives and then indicators and targets. More recently, what we've started to see is that this implementation process has started to extend and go beyond not just implementation, but now also into monitoring and evaluation. This is some interesting, there's a very interesting chapter in the most recent National Climate Assessment, NCA4, that tried to sort of look at the process of adaptation and where the focus of the literature and the focus of the practice was. And so if you look at that inner ring in this diagram, 2014, that much of the work that was being done on adaptation was sort of understanding the assessment, some of the vulnerability questions, and then into questions of planning. And then if you look at that outer gray ring for 2018, you can see there was a lot more literature starting to be emerge on implementation. Now, 2 years on, really what you could, if one was doing this assessment today, I think we're in a very rapid period of change and growth, and that monitoring and evaluation is really becoming kind of key and a central part of how we can think and look at adaptation. And of course, you know, cities are responding. The city of New York recently came out this past April, a kind of a comprehensive plan on creating a future vision of the city, NYC 2050, which included questions of equity, diversity, inclusion into its planning efforts, with a recognition that this was sort of part and parcel of how to enhance the capacity for resiliency efforts to work. And so that's what I kind of want to sort of start to look at a little bit more directly through these sets of kind of starter questions or issues that we've identified for this particular webinar. One is that issue of enabling conditions. So these are things that have now become emergent in the literature and also on the ground that create opportunities for successful implementation. Now, of course, that issue of what is success and how to measure it and how to communicate that becomes quite central. And so I'll speak a little bit about that. Lisa Dilling, who will follow me in the presentation order today, will talk more directly on some of those issues, particularly with some interesting casework from Western Water. Then the other thing is the sort of connecting resiliency efforts to ongoing quality of life concerns, and where are they consistent, where are they not, and what the implications when those conditions don't quite mesh. And then, of course, how to make those adjustments. How can we use the sort of monitoring, evaluation, reporting, and learning process to make, you know, ongoing and iterative kind of adjustments to a process, make it much more flexible. So I'm just going to speak to each one of these topics a little bit. Again, my presentation here is to sort of lay out some of the groundwork for our discussions and weave in some examples that I've been connected with in the city of New York and more generally within CC-RUN. So in terms of enabling adaptation, I think what we recognize is that, you know, if we were thinking about these questions maybe a few years ago, a lot of issues were on barriers and limits or boundaries, you know, to adaptation. Why isn't it working? I think one of the things, you know, that we've started to recognize is that an increasing focus certainly on these issues, but also what are the examples, the lessons learned, the translatable sorts of things that enable and facilitate and even accelerating adaptation. How can we sort of make this process move forward, especially in the recognition that you know, in many cases the adaptation process needs to accelerate given the nature of ongoing climate change. So what are some of the key things that come out of the literature? There are many, you know, different ways of phrasing these categories, but some of the key determinants and some of the indicators, things that are defined as enabling adaptation, knowledge and awareness of the issues, the science base certainly critical, the technology available for monitoring and evaluation, the infrastructure. This is specifically an example obviously relevant to hydrologic, you know, climate adaptation. So the stuff that's needed to further the process of adaptation, probably almost consistently seen as the most significant ones, you know, are just below now: human capital and institutions and governance, making sure that there is leadership expertise, but also that there's an effective mechanism through which to translate that expertise and leadership, and then also to with that a clear understanding of how to treat equity issues, enhance conditions of trust. Resources are, of course, key in this whole process, as well as some level of autonomy to make those decisions in an effective way. I'll turn for a moment here to this issue of success, and Lisa Dilling and others put forward a really interesting piece that sort of clarified some of these issues. That, you know, measuring success, which of course the metric that many of us have, if we're working as a practitioner or policymaker, is this moving the needle, and what's the cost effectiveness? I think the critical thing is that there's no single definition, and so there's a large community debating like how to use success as a concept. Obviously, questions of money and sort of net value from decision making is key, but how about distributed benefits, non-market benefits? There's a number of questions that emerge here, and then of course there's all these different notions of risk and risk perspectives and tolerances. If you look at the diagram on the right, this is a diagram that we've used a lot in the New York City Panel on Climate Change and in other contexts, the idea of an acceptable level of risk, and that line is sort of a culturally determined line. How much risk is sort of agreed upon to be accepted, and what happens as we approach it? Does that line get moved? What's the implications of that line? So we definitely sort of recognize that there's that this sort of notion of acceptable risk can change over time. And then, of course, the issue is who defines it, and how is that sort of boundary measured? How is success measured? Of course, is a key element in this. Not only in this sort of context, but in many other contexts in which we make decision making. So one of the other things that we see, when a lot of these issues get applied within cities, and not all cities, but certainly some cities, and some of the work that I've been doing for the city of New York and in other larger cities throughout the Northeast, there's increasing kind of community-level concern about the process of resilience. Certainly, they recognize the value, community members recognize the value, the importance of it, but they're also seeing that there are other issues at work, meaning one is that the process of resiliency and some of the efforts associated with it might increase the conditions through which community change would take place, and basically limit their capacity to live in those locations. And I'll talk more about this notion of green gentrification or climate gentrification. A range of other concerns. Policies are not really well articulated or communicated at the local level. There's many examples where cities will start street tree programs, and they'll just arrive one day and start planting trees. People don't know what they're for, how they can be managed, what the implications of them are, or even how to sustain them. And obviously there are some cases where there are stewardship programs, but again, this idea of things are not well communicated. This metric of success, as I sort of noted, lack of resources to fully implement things, and then also sort of lack of capacity to deal with sort of larger transformative questions in communities, rather than just sort of these small incremental issues of resiliency. So there's a lot of concern. This question of green gentrification or climate gentrification has popped up not only within the academic literature, but is really very much present in a lot of communities, particularly communities that see themselves as sort of marginalized and at risk of potential community change, not only in terms of some of the current shifts and risk burdens, but also future displacement that might come with shifts in local real estate. And this is some illustration of some of that work, which has appeared at very high level in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So this is obviously a question that's reached at some significance. And I just, in preparation for this, found a really interesting case study looking at the sort of interconnection of some gentrification processes and resiliency efforts in the city of Philadelphia. And just graphically, you can see, the larger the blue dot, the enhanced focus on some of these resiliency efforts and sort of with that gentrification. And this study kind of highlights that sort of, potential overlap that emerges, of course, becoming an issue with respect to success of resiliency efforts. So one of the responses to this is that, again, going back to the New York City Panel on Climate Change, has been an explicit effort to try to develop a community-based adaptation process in which some of these issues of community resiliency efforts are baked into the resiliency planning that in this case, the city of New York might do. And the last bullet point here, the effective adaptation planning requires incorporation of distributional, contextual, and procedural equity. And so it's in that sort of framing that we see potentially some ways of sort of moving past this issue with respect to opposition, local opposition to resiliency efforts. I'll give you an example of some other work that we've been doing in the neighborhood of Canarsie, which is on Jamaica Bay, and the upper left graphic illustrates some of the flood-prone areas of the neighborhood. And one of the things that was done as part of something called the Cycles of Resilience project is attempt to sort of work directly with community members and groups through which to help them define their own resiliency-focused activities, and then cross-connect that with opportunities that the city was trying to develop simultaneously. So both a top-down and a bottom-up. And they came up with some really interesting ideas about a community center, that, resilience center or hub, the notion of how to link some of the kind of a fun title, blue, green, and everything in between, so to sort of connect both the urban green space and water space, and sort of define connecting physical landscape features, and those who are focused really on streets and how to enhance resiliency as a street-based project. Even other things like street flooding, to sort of engage the community to develop a community-based street flooding map, because this is an area that floods frequently with rainstorms, increasingly could be subject to sunny day flooding issues, and so we need to engage the community to sort of help record this process. So with that, let me shift to one of the other topics that we're kind of introducing here, this idea of the MURAL, or monitoring, evaluation, reporting, learning, and adaptive resiliency. And what we see in this process, this is some other recent work that's been adapted, that there are many kind of points of intervention where this kind of iterative process can play out and make adjustments. So the idea of sort of building in a flexibility to the adaptation wheel, and not making it sort of only one pathway, but emergent multiple pathways, and to, of course, make these sort of connecting to this previous issue, something that also works at the local level and engages with local folks. So one of the things, of course, with this is the idea of developing core and effective indicators and monitoring strategies. Again, back with the City of New York, one of the big initiatives that came out of the last report was a proposal to put forward a resilience indicator and monitoring system, and by that provide a transparent, consistent, updatable version of understanding how various sort of metrics of resiliency are playing out, not only in terms of the risk profile, not only in terms of potential impacts, but indicators and monitoring strategies for adaptation strategies, and to sort of log and to record that process over time. And a key part of this sort of indicator monitoring system was to sort of work with community-based partnerships with scientists and stakeholders to sort of keep that regular process of even evaluation of the indicators and potential need for adjustment of those indicators moving forward. A range of other sort of elements play out in this issue, and of course this is a major question, how to develop these indicator systems. So what I want to do is just, in the remaining few minutes of the presentation, sort of shift, taking some of these elements, both the enablers, the success, and some of these monitoring and evaluation, and then start to sort of see what are the implications for that and what role social science might play, both in engaging more specifically with practitioners and policymakers, but also how could we sort of create an iterative process from those communities back into the academic community. So one of the things that's always been sort of profound in my own thinking, this is some earlier work, thinking about resilience and the connection to sort of transformative adaptation and sort of the mixture of different perspectives that play out. And this was some survey work that done a little while ago, and the quote always sticks with me is that, we've developed a lot of good climate science, we're developing some resiliency efforts, but really, at the core, we can't acknowledge that we have to fundamentally change how we live in New York City. This is a quote from a local practitioner. And I think one of the things that comes up in this sort of diagram, or this kind of quote and sort of graphic, is this issue that resiliency efforts, while absolutely significant and that they're being implemented, There also is, given our understanding of the rate of, let's say in this case, sea level rise, the implications for occupancy, that we also have to think about larger scale or sort of different approaches, maybe more transformative approaches to coastal occupancy. So instead of thinking about, let's say, for example, green and gray infrastructure to protect communities from coastal communities from flooding, we also have to start to think about larger and more kind of profound questions of coastal occupancy, residency, zoning, and all the other issues that come at increasingly high-risk locations. And so with that, we've started to sort of, think about this idea of how to connect, resiliency efforts, not only in terms of where the communities are now, in terms of the risk, but where they're going in the future, but also more fully ground them, in these resiliency efforts with other concerns and other stressors and other concerns about quality of life that these communities have. Because I think, all of us or many of us sort of working in communities recognize that while flooding is a question or heat is a question or whatever the other risk might be, to them also, jobs, good education, access to health care, and of course, this is even before the COVID-19 outbreak. I mean, there's so many kind of questions within communities, and for resiliency efforts, we need to sort of figure out how to connect with those. And then with that, we have to sort of understand this issue of risk perception and how these perceptions are shifting as the climate science is emerging, and how the implications of that shifting risk perception has for the decisions that people make in the coastal zone. So are people deciding that that the risk is now too high, they want to leave or relocate? So these are critical questions that are playing out. And the other thing that's most sort of significant is like how effective is some of these community engagement efforts that we're trying to do and prepare residents for resiliency. And that's another kind of emergent question that we're trying to grapple with. So we've done a few surveys and workshops with local practitioners. This is some other CC-run related work where we had a set of stakeholders and practitioners and policymakers on coastal Long Island and then also coastal New Jersey, basically asking them, well, what are some of the key information needs, the key kind of lessons learned that they're grappling with, but also things that they need. And it becomes very kind of edifying, or sort of it becomes more clear as to the kinds of issues that are needed. And one of the things, the kind of information that's needed, and one of the things that we've done is taken this kind of workshop result and then turned it into a household survey, and then using that information to feed back into some of the stakeholder and practitioner needs. So some of the key takeaways, I mean, things like environmental justice. So this is like the practitioners and policymakers, that they lack sort of meaningful engagement with communities, on these sorts of topics. And that, other things like the variation in risk exposure and risk understanding of risk becomes a huge part, and something that they have to sort of grapple with as they start to implement some of these policies. And then, of course, there's different types of occupancy. There's the rental, there's the homeowners, there's the seasonal. So there's a range of different sort of potential property owners that these stakeholders and policymakers are dealing with, and that becomes important in how they see the effectiveness of their programs. They need more information about how people experience risk. They need more information about, the value and benefits of gray and green infrastructure. And really just, more data overall about how some of these practices are sort of being perceived and understood. So we began a couple of surveys. Unfortunately, some of the survey work is now on hold, given that this was door-to-door. But this is just some of the results that we're now feeding back, to the stakeholders. So, for example, this is some of the communities on Long Island asking whether or not, what's their consideration with respect to moving from their current home. Some are already planning. About 5% of these respondents said, they've had enough. The Sandy was enough, and there's still other sort of risks that they see emergent. But then another storm like Sandy or something like that in the next 5 years could mean a significant sort of change in occupancy, or at least a change in how these residents see their community. Of course, there's always that disconnect between what they say and behavior, but again, this provides information for the policy stakeholder, policymaker, and a practitioner about how their programs might be understood. Even other things like, trust in various sources of information. In this case, we asked them, well, which ones do you most likely trust? I mean, again, this was this past fall and into the early winter. Federal government and local government were by far seen as the most trusted. And so that would also become an important piece of information for these local resiliency efforts, how to present that, how to utilize that information in their planning practice. So we also have developed a set of decision support tools. There's a number of resiliency toolkits that are available, and they're excellent. But one of the things that we found in some of the conversations with folks is that we really want to be able to develop some toolkits that are very specific and useful at particular moments and in particular ways, that they saw this as the greatest potential advantage. The large resiliency toolkits, the soup to nuts approaches are useful, but they also find, this is again for the practitioner and policymaker perspective, they find specific things of particular use. And I'll just highlight them very quickly. I don't want to take up too much time. But one of them is the idea that in the context of an extreme event, there are these sort of policy windows or where new initiatives could be put forward. And so what we tried to do is develop a kind of a decision support tool that will promote different types of learning in this sort of additive process, and sort of embed it right in between that response and recovery moment where there's a rich opportunity for learning both individually and collectively, and that in turn that might then help accelerate the process of bringing new adaptation strategies into effect. So we call this the post-extreme event learning toolkit. I can come back to that if there are questions, but that's one example. Another one is to sort of more directly connect adaptation with these sort of quality of life indicators. A fundamental issue that we found both in some application work in the Northeast, particularly in Metro New York, but also more recently in Metro Miami, is that communities are at the very essence, concerned about a range of quality of life issues, and in many cases, and if not all cases, threat from risk and hazards are not their everyday concern. There are a multitude of others, everything from affordable housing to public services, all the kinds of things that we talked about. So we developed this adaptation tool that explicitly kind of engages with communities in a workshop setting where we say, okay, so how might climate change your quality of life? And then, moving from that, what kinds of adaptation strategies might you see appropriate to not only maintain that quality of life, but in maybe some cases, enhance opportunity for quality of life. And in this sort of discursive way, this sort of promotes a lot of interesting discussion. We did this one application most recently in Miami and really came up with a series of really quite profound statements about desire for public health protection, prevention of gentrification, housing affordability, and other kind of broad environmental qualities of living in Metro Miami that people were most focused on protecting, and then how to sort of connect those ambitions with quality of life, with climate change adaptation. So interesting materials. So what I want to do is just sort of kind of close now, and I think we're going to be opening up for some questions in a moment. But I think one of the things that we can say as we kind of highlight this sort of pivot from concept to practice, that as we start to sort of move into that space, there really is a dramatic need for social science research. I've been looking at the question of urban climate change action, vulnerability for more than 20 years. And at this point, I could tell you that right now, it's like it is the moment for social science, because what we're seeing now is these programs, strategies are being developed, and now the issue is how to make that process more successful. So if you look back into the past couple of decades, just to sort of as a quick thread, our work as social science or in the social science domain has really advanced our understanding of impacts and vulnerabilities of different groups. But now as these things are being implemented, we see a whole new set of questions, the issue of costs, metrics, the role of enabling conditions. This really powerful and it's not, it's not insurmountable, but it needs to be very directly evaluated, the issue of equity and how these policies are connected to issues of social equity and economic equity. We see, just in the recent COVID, the importance and the devastation that this brings to communities, and this is sort of embedded in their experience with a range of different efforts, and resiliency, in some cases through the green and climate gentrification umbrella is being seen in that light. And then also, what are some of those opportunities to move from everyday resiliency efforts that we're seeing and to jump scale, so to speak, into more transformative adaptation? I didn't really get into that space very much in this presentation, but that is another sort of looming issue. How do we sort of recognize when the resiliency efforts in a particular system regime has kind of reached its limit, so to speak, and we need to sort of reimagine the process of different types of resiliency, or sort of, in my example earlier, different types of occupancy of the coastal zone. So a lot of this work, obviously, CC Run, RISA has been key. There are a lot of other sort of threads and partners and things that have come into this mix, and I want to thank all those folks. And I want to thank you all for spending a little time sort of thinking about and hearing my words. And I'll send it back to Franco to lead us through the next step. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Bill. That was great. A lot there for us to think about. With that, I'd like to open it up to questions. If you have not yet answered or put questions in the chat room, please do so. And I will invite our other two panelists, so Chelsea from NOAA and Lisa, who's our next speaker, to join this discussion. So you can ask questions directly to Bill about his presentation. And I see there are some already there, or you can ask sort of general questions that I can pose to the group. So let's start with the questions directly to Bill. Starting from the top, Lewis had a question about knowledge and awareness, and makes the point that knowledge and awareness, you can be knowledgeable, you can be aware, and not necessarily accept. In other words, you can be a denier of climate risks at the same time that you have the knowledge that you would need. And so he poses the question, how do you promote acceptance of the need to act to deniers? And I just thought maybe an interesting way of thinking about that is another crisis where there's sort of science at the crux, which is COVID, of course. And that science was presented in a way that led to people all over the world, unprecedented numbers staying home. So that's a different situation where, perhaps the denier tendency was subverted under the knowledge and awareness. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. It's probably, it's like profound and some, as you start to peel it apart, because there was a very interesting piece written by Howard Kunruther, who's at Penn, and Paul Slovic, that was sent out over the wire shortly as the COVID really took force in March. And basically what they argued for is the point that Lewis just raised in a way. We could see that we as educated folks and sort of understanding the issues, we could see things coming at us, but somehow we can't really respond, or we can't really fully cognize it. So their piece is quite chilling in a way to read it through, because we had evidence and understanding of COVID, not to go into COVID, but we weren't able to respond to it. We were sort of flat-footed. And I think one of the easy responses that people have is that with climate change, shifting back to that, it is more experiential. So and maybe this is I apologize for a cop-out, but if people experience it or hear about it, from somebody next door, or if they see it, that becomes, that sort of catalyzes knowledge and awareness. You know, one would hope that we don't have to be in that situation, you know, and that we can recognize and move with knowledge and awareness. So, you know, I think the other way to think about it is that if you think of those enabling conditions, they're multiple, and they oftentimes work in concert, and it is that sort of secret, you know, recipe of linking different enabling conditions that brings forward action in some contexts and not in others. But I think that's some of the good social science work that's going on now, trying to figure out what is that best mix. But the knowledge and awareness piece is a very, very difficult nut to crack. And I would recommend looking at that Konrother Slovak piece, which is available online.
Great, thanks, Bill. Chelsea, Lisa, do you want to add anything to that? It was a really interesting question.
The only thing that came to mind. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
Lisa, why don't you go first? Go ahead.
Super. Yeah, that's a great point that Bill's making, and I think another piece of this that I've been trying to think about myself as well, based on my research, is even with full acceptance of the problem, there are different ways people think are acceptable to solve that problem. People have different worldviews about the degree to which, for example, the government should be involved in a solution or not. And so those are not disagreements. The idea that if we accept the science of it and the reality of the problem, it doesn't necessarily imply the same solution. So I believe there's a piece of this which is actually that some people, there's different solutions that are acceptable to different people, and the solution that's acceptable to me may not be the same as for someone else. And as Bill mentioned in his talk, the idea of risk tolerance is also very important, as we see even with the COVID response. Some people are very comfortable staying home and feel that's the safest thing. Other people feel like they're okay going out and mingling with people, and they don't mind taking that risk. So I wouldn't say that the people mingling together are necessarily denying the reality. I think they may be simply saying, I'm willing to accept a higher level of risk. So that's just another piece to think through. Possibly.
It's interesting. It's consistent with this idea of adaptation being an emergent property, so that, you know, folks suffering the same risk in different places may come to the conclusion that different. You can't prescribe the adaptation strategy. It has to emerge from local preferences. I don't know, Chelsea, you wanted to say something earlier.
Yeah, not as robust as those two answers, but I remember an argument that was made a couple years back, I think, that I thought was interesting. It was meant to make us feel better about this issue. And it looked at, I think it's the Yale Climate Change Center that's done some work looking at perceptions across the U.S., you know, so whether people think that climate is an issue, is a significant issue, whether they're very concerned or, you know, whether they kind of deny it exists. And the proportion of people across the U.S. in the last survey that they did was, if you looked at sort of the very concerned and the ones that were sort of willing to do something about it, willing to consider it, it was over 50% of the population. And so the argument was focus on those people, and, you know, don't worry too much about the 10% that's in the denial portion of that.
Yeah. So let's move on. We've got a lot of questions here. The next one is from Rob. Sorry. Go ahead, Lisa. Did you have something else to add?
Oh, I was just going to say on Chelsea's answer that's an excellent point, and there are hardly any policies for which you get 100% agreement. I mean, there's probably none. So the idea of how much acceptance, how much agreement do we need to move forward, I do not think we need to convince every last person of the same.
Great, thanks. So the next comment is from Rob Graff, and Rob makes the point that consideration, inclusivity, outreach, these are all important processes, but they take a whole lot of time. And at the same time, we're talking about urgent need to act with climate risks increasing regularly. So how do you, Bill, back to you, how do you sort of reconcile these competing goals. And on the one hand, you want to do your due diligence and be participatory, inclusive, but on the other hand, that slows you down, and there are issues of cost and time that need to be addressed. So where do you draw the line? How do you balance those two issues?
Yeah, no, these are great questions. So, and difficult. So I think one of the things, just as a start as well, is that kind of embedded in that is here a little bit is this issue of the rate at which science can develop new knowledge. And that in some cases we see the process of climate change, some of the shifts, some of the implications for rain periodicity or heat, etc. The understanding of vulnerabilities, implications for community action, etc. I mean, all that stuff takes time, and in some cases, there's one of my other hats. I'm connected with the IPCC Working Group 2 report, and one of the big questions that comes up in these assessments, these massive assessments of the literature, is that the wheels turn like every 7 years, and it's like the idea is that the assessment process and the understanding, the building of new knowledge is increasingly it's a hard word to say, disconnected, but the demands for knowledge is increasing more rapidly than the infrastructure of science to produce it, and in this context. But more specific to the comment about engagement, that's a classic problem. I mean, it's a very profound issue. I mean, and it goes into this issue of capacity to act. I mean, and we've seen again, this debate even in the COVID question. Not to go back to that, but it's such a clear example. Autocratic states or top-down governance where there's things are put down by fiat, like this is how we're going to respond. You see immediate sort of actions. Other places where there's contestation, where there's debate, et cetera, things get slowed, and there's frustration with that. I think one of the things that's emerging, at least it's kind of in my own mind, about how the practice of science emerges. I think one of the things, there's a couple things that I'll say quickly and shift it over. One is that I think scientists and people who do urban climate work, I think, are benefited from working with detailed examples in a couple of case settings. It's in those sorts of settings where you can develop the relationships, the understanding, and the capacity to sort of define and illustrate process, which then becomes useful in potential decision-making, practitioner work, policy-making, et cetera. And I think, so that's one of the compromises that you have to make as an academic or as a researcher. Are you going to focus on a few areas, or are you going to sort of include multiple case studies? And I think at some level you start to lose capacity to define new knowledge. The other issue that the challenge comes up is that how the research process takes place, where if we have a large event, whether it's a large hurricane or a flood event, suddenly everybody sort of gravitates to that area and becomes an expert on Katrina or Harvey or Sandy or whatever it is, and people come into the research realm to focus on that question. And in many cases, that work is kind of, it leads to sort of a kind of incoherence in terms of how all that work can be organized and sort of made, and the results that come from it, the new knowledge that emerges. So I think on the academic side, we need to be much more effective in doing work, in that post-event context. So I've said a lot, and there's no really good answer, because it's a classic kind of, do you want participatory democracy, and sort of decision-making, which is a muddled, convoluted, frustrating process, or do you want top-down decision-making? Various ways and various contexts, both models have produced meaningful results. I think what we're finding, though, in some of the climate resilience stuff that's being developed by municipalities is that it's hitting these headwinds of local community opposition in some cases. Not all, but many. And so the issue is how to overcome that.
Great. We have a lot of questions. So if it's okay with Lisa and Chelsea, I'm going to just pose one more to Bill.
I'll be shorter, I promise.
comes out of his presentation, and then we should move on. We'll have another opportunity to engage Lisa and Chelsea at the end after Lisa gives her talk. But there's sort of a group of questions about community groups, local groups, and they kind of span different topics. So, there's a question about why, some of the work you presented showed low level of trust of community groups. There's another question there about how do you measure the effectiveness of community engagement? How do you know that you're actually, when you're trying to reach out to community organizations on climate change, how do you know that you're getting through? And then there's a related question there about how appropriately to engage local groups on global issues, especially ones that have sort of lots of uncertainty associated with them. So I don't know if you want to sort of touch on that whole topic of community organizations and local groups briefly, maybe just 2 minutes or so.
Yeah, it's a huge, it's obviously a big topic. I think the question of trust is quite fundamental. And I think, I was always struck, I'm a little bit of a student of history, and I teach a class in kind of New York City environmental history. And when the city of New York started its trash removal process, it was sort of all codified, and people were wearing white outfits, and they would go into communities and start to kind of pick up the trash, literally. In some cases, they were heralded as great things. In other cases, they were like literally attacked by local neighborhood groups. Why is that? Well, there was a sense of mistrust of all things government, because it was seen as either some way an imposition in their community or a potential for community change. And so this issue of trust and mistrust goes back long and deep in many cities. And I think we see it again, in the context of resiliency, where it's not always clear to the communities what is the intent of the policy. And of course, in a place like New York, where there's questions about housing and housing costs and other things associated with redevelopment, it is sometimes seen as a great question mark, some of these resiliency efforts. And that's sort of embedded in this kind of long-standing mistrust. In terms of engaging with communities, I think one of the things that, and this goes back to this question of time, I mean, it literally, it takes a tremendous amount of time and a commitment to sort of engage with communities. And in some of the places that I've talked with, again, some City of New York examples, but they don't really even want to talk to outside academics or other people, or if they will, it will take a long time to develop that sense of trust. And in many communities, they're also even talking about like having like a memorandum of understanding. If you're going to work with my community, if you're going to come in, there are obviously a lot of local community groups. If you're going to sort of engage with us, you have to sort of review this material, and you have to work X number of years. You have to sort of commit to sort of give us back, your key results, and the like. So it becomes a long-term commitment, and it's in that long-term commitment that you can start to talk about issues, small and large, but it's a very as with any relationship, it takes time and it takes work, and that's and so it's not something to be taken lightly. I guess that's a short way of ending it. But I apologize if that wasn't a full good answer.
That's great, thanks. I mean, we should switch over, but quickly, Lisa, Chelsea, do you want to add anything briefly to Bill's response? Lisa, like your experience working with community organizations out west?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's always a conundrum for any of us in this space. I think that one of the answers, and some of the other recent partners have found this, is to kind of make more of the teachers and the implementers and kind of like think about communities of practice, talking to each other rather than, I mean, the scale is just a big question about how, and then building of trust, that question of building of trust, I mean, Bill's exactly right about how you engage and how you make sure to be giving back and so on. But it's also, we have found, and we've directly looked at this, is that people tend to trust people in their own industry or in their own field because they're taking the risk of adopting a new innovation, a new type of information, or a new way of doing things. And so looking to others in their own field, whether it's water management or so on, that somebody else has tried this and found that it worked, rather than academics, for example, saying, oh, this is a great idea, you should try it. So I think trying to expand sort of the community of practice and building trust that way from people who, taking on these new innovations and then
Thanks.
spreading.
Chuck, do you have any concluding thoughts on this?
I agree with that point a lot, and it kind of goes back to what Bill said maybe in the last question around it matters who the messenger is, I think, on some of this. In addition to the community of practice idea, one thing RISA is sort of newly piloting is using the train-the-trainer model, which has been used in a lot of other contexts. So probably some folks on the line are familiar with that, and sort of letting a community lead on what they would like to do in terms of adaptation, and having sort of the research community that comes from a RISA back them up in terms of giving them information as they're moving along, but they really run the show in terms of that process, and then hoping that they can then take sort of their knowledge of going through that process and the different hurdles that they've gone through to another community that's interested in going through that process. So it becomes a little bit more removed in a bit of a chain from the RISA itself, but still has.
Those are all great points. Thanks to the three of you, and thanks to our participants for all the great questions. There are more questions, but I want to make sure we move on. You will have another opportunity to ask questions after Lisa's presentation. But before I introduce Lisa, we're going to move to a transition activity. We're going to pose 2 questions, and we hope that you will share your experiences and ideas. So you see question 1 on the left, question 2 on the right. We'll take just a couple of minutes for you to put your thoughts, and you can answer one or both, and then we'll have a little discussion about it. So the questions are, number 1, what enabling conditions have helped make resilience work successful? Again, speaking from your own experience. And question 2 is about metrics. What is a metric that you are using to illustrate and communicate the success of resilience effort? Is the metric resonating with the people, or is there a metric that you've seen that really resonates with you? So if you could we'll take a couple of minutes. In the classroom, this is when the professor asks the teacher and nobody answers. We'll have a couple of awkward seconds. So we're starting to get questions answers on the enabling conditions. Funding, seeking input, more funding, funding keeps coming up, funding, engagement, collaboration. So we're getting a lot more questions on the enabling conditions. So that's, I guess, encouraging in one sense. It's that people have identified circumstances or conditions that lead to action. I don't know if my fellow panelists want to jump in on any of these things. Funding is a pretty common, of course, if you have money to do something, you will do something, right? These comments are coming faster than I can read them.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, I'm.
Bill, I had a question.
Go.
Well, I had a question for you, sort of thinking about some of this piece and what you presented, and I can't remember actually if you presented it today or in another presentation I've seen by you, but coming out of the survey work you've done in New York City, one of the challenges you mentioned was funding, so it's not surprising that this is coming up. But the other one was around sort of, I think you called it coordination. So for example, in a city, how different plans might be coordinated in terms of how they're thinking about adaptation and how you actually enable that to happen so you don't get maladaptation, for example. And I was curious if, in New York or elsewhere, you've got some examples for Lisa too, on sort of the institutional changes that might enable that. So like, for example, in New York City, having the Office of Resiliency there, has that made a difference, institutionally in terms of that coordination, or are there some other?
I don't. I can respond, or maybe Lisa will respond. I'll just say very quickly. This is another kind of touchstone question, because what you have in New York and a lot of the Northeast, where there's been a lot of implementation, a lot of discussion on adaptation, a lot of implementation at the local level. There's kind of a little bit of need to understand the coherence between them, because oftentimes they emerge from different, to your point, they emerge from different entities. And like for the city of New York and the Jamaica Bay, more specifically, you have the federal government being a major player, you have the state of New York being a major player, and the city of New York also being a major player. And oftentimes there's not a lot of interagency, connectivity. There is some, but oftentimes not the interagency sort of stuff, collaboration that you would expect. And even within New York State, there are a lot of initiatives and a lot of sort of, things that could provide resources for counties of the state, as example. But at the county level, so people are trying to sort of figure out, like, what are all these various programs, what are these initiatives, how do they differ, how do they coordinate? So your question about the Office of Resilience, I think, well, certainly that helps as a kind of a coordinating entity, but also they find, I don't want to obviously speak for them, but I can say that there seems to have been moments where their capacity to coordinate is limited, because these are entities, in some cases, like, they're large, agencies within even the city of New York, like the Department of Environmental Protection, which is a massive, whatever it is, $20 billion or more capital fund entity with a huge history. They operate by themselves in some cases and don't really connect as clearly at times with MOR. But then, of course, the state of New York also operates outside the range of MOR. So MOR is great, but also it has to deal with these large, bureaucracies around them. So, I don't know, Lisa, if you want to add anything. Yeah.
I think I'll say just really quickly we don't have a city obviously as large as New York in our region, but it's amazing how much stovepiping happens even at a smaller city that's 30,000 people. And also just the point about the funding, even these resilience officers, I've heard also anecdotally, they are put in, into the city, but unless they have direct access to being able to shape the budget, for example, of a city or of a municipality, it's very tough to change priorities, to actually implement, even if you do great plans, even if you do very, inclusive and participatory planning, unless you have a tie-in to the budget and the way that is spent and the staff taking on board the priorities, it's very tough to actually make forward progress. So I think there's actually a lot of work around connecting things across silos, and also understanding how to put these priorities into action through the actual spending of them.
As a quick follow-up, not to get to reveal my length of time I've been thinking about this, but in some ways the resiliency question is sort of where environmental management was 30 years ago, with a lot of different agencies, a lot of different sort of mandates, and throughout the 1990s there was a lot of drive to try to coordinate and provide coherence, across, through interagency initiatives, like the Everglades as one example. So I think in some ways there's a real, kind of reflecting on your point, there's a real call for that kind of enhanced capacity for coordination.
Just to
because there's so many.
Yeah, it's amazing. We go into a small town and we got a table of folks, 5, 12 people around the table, and the different department heads are like, wow, we haven't had a meeting like this since 2012, just kind of connecting people around the issue. And I mean, and we're just a university group. We're not, you know, we don't know anything compared to folks around the table, but that fact of us coming and convening a group and people showing up to participate and talk across these lines was really valuable in that process. That's one of the things I think RISAs tend to do, is try to be a convener. But it is a struggle constantly, because also I would say staff turnover. I don't know, we haven't mentioned that yet, but you can get agreements and move action forward with a particular group of staff, but if that person in that job moves on and somebody new comes in, you might have to completely rebuild those relationships and that
we're gonna. These are great. It's great discussion. It breaks my heart to to sort of cut it off, but I do want to just say a couple of things summarizing the metrics question. We've got some interesting responses, and just building off what you were just saying, Lisa. One of the metrics was attendance at meetings. So if you're increasing attendance at meetings, or if your mailing list is getting bigger, then you know you're getting through to people. There were also some very concrete examples, like changes in tree canopy in certain neighborhoods is somehow a measurement of how far you're getting through with to people, or changes in life expectancy. Although, you know, there's some interesting questions about, you know, what rate will you see, back to that timing question. You know, are you going to be able to determine changes in life expectancy at the rate at which we need to see change, or is the change, you know, life expectancy changes would happen over a longer period of time? And then there were questions on, you know, there were issues of behavior and people's risk tolerance. And, you know, are they making calculated risks? Are they knowingly proceeding at risk? So interesting metrics here to start looking comprehensively at, you know, what is emerging in neighborhoods and what people's behavior is telling us. But I think at this point, it is my duty as moderator to move us on. These questions, of course, anyone who accesses this later using YouTube, you can really look through the list. There's no possible way for us to discuss them all. So with that, I want to thank Bill and all of you for your questions. And let's move on to our next presenter. There we go. So our next presenter you just met, Lisa Dilling. She's the director of the Western Water Assessment and an associate professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And her research topics include drought, urban water management, climate adaptation in cities and on public lands, carbon management, and geoengineering governance. So with that, I will hand it over to Lisa and join you at the end.
Wonderful. Thanks, Franco, and thanks, Bill, for that great overview talk in the beginning. You really set the stage well. I just wanted to talk today about this issue that is really focusing in on a particular case area of, you know, why do some communities move forward and take action in the face of a risk, and why do some not? I think it's one of these questions that we were sort of touching on a little bit, and we talked about denial and so forth in the past, but we really wanted to dig into this question of why communities are taking action. And I'll just point out I have collaborators on this work that's listed at the bottom, and there's a paper you can go read in greater detail that I'll put up at the end. Okay, so today, obviously, you're all here on this webinar. Why focus on cities? Why look at adaptation in cities? You know this, but most of the world's cities population are actually living in cities. Cities are the front line for responding to existing natural hazards. And also, a lot of the actions needed to adapt to climate change are going to be carried out at the municipal level, even though we need action at higher levels as well. And secondly, this research that I'm going to be talking about today is really looking at adaptation to existing natural hazards, not climate change per se. So things like droughts, floods, winter storms, things like that. And the reason for focusing on existing natural hazards and how they're responded to is that we feel like it's a good natural analogy to how we'll behave thinking about adaptation to climate change. And there's also a really long history from the natural hazards literature on how we do respond, what kinds of things work, and so forth. And we can draw on that literature to base our study a little bit. Also, it's a kind of the similar thing where, you know, like Bill mentioned, you know, quality of life is much more salient to people than thinking about climate change or these hazards. It's an issue sometimes without a policy without publics, as they say. So it has these similar features. So we really focus in today on studies of why communities are taking action in the face of these risks. So I also wanted to say, too, that many of you are working in this space on climate policy in general at the municipal level, but we found, and the research shows anyway, that it's often much more common for cities to have work going on climate mitigation, so things that address energy policy, emissions, things like renewable energy or light bulbs or things like that. Many fewer cities have adaptation plans, and that is rapidly changing. As Bill said, that the landscape is very dynamic right now, but it's something that's just not as common to find. So it's hard to do a study like we were going to talk about today on climate adaptation and what caused people to move on climate adaptation. So, and it's also, I would say, it's a lot more political. There's different reasons why people might have climate action plans. There's a lot of research about what motivates communities to sign up for these kinds of things, and that makes it a little bit different than adaptation, which is much more about the risk itself and what's going to be happening to my city directly. So today I'm going to talk about our research focused a lot on this question: what causes some communities to take adaptive action in the face of weather and climate-related risks? And the reason, too, another motivating factor is there's been research on barriers to adaptation, so thinking about, gosh, why couldn't people adapt? Why didn't they adapt? But this is really flipping that question around and trying to say, well, what does cause people to adapt? Why do people do things? What are the proactive, what is the positive of this? Why people do actually take this action? So the research today is far away from New York. I live out in Colorado, and my RISA is focused on these three states: Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. And we have some larger cities, but not at all like New York, like I say, but we're a mix of some larger cities, but then quite a few smaller cities, quite a few smaller communities. And our focus is like the CC Run, again, like trying to get science into practice. But we really studied this area. We studied this question in our particular three states. Today, I also am going to focus on a study that is a mixed method study. So we did a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. We took a random selection of 60 of our municipalities around Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, between 10,000 people and 70,000 people, plus all of the big cities. So, I mean, there's really only a few in our region, Denver, Salt Lake City, a couple other cities that are really above 70,000. So we're really talking about kind of mid-sized cities here rather than like the really big mega cities. And we focused, our data comes from these interviews of municipal officials, and then we also have consulted other kinds of data like the Sheldis data set that looks at cost of disasters and how frequently things have hit and so on. We also then coded the results we got from these interviews, and we did statistics on those results. And we paired that along with 6 really in-depth case studies of 6 locations in the region to really get a handle on more the why as well as the breadth of looking at it from a quantitative basis. So just to give you an example, to hopefully convince you from a quick example that there really are big differences in how different communities respond to different kinds of risks. So this is just a little story here. Both of these communities here that I have 2 quotes on have a risk of flooding. So they both get flooded quite frequently. And the first municipality has this quote saying, "I think we have one of the best flood mitigation programs west of the Mississippi. If you look at our flood rating, it's one of the highest. We've done a lot in the area of educating people, warning systems, monitoring rivers and streams, and we minimize construction and life safety issues in our floodplains. We're actually pretty aggressive in that area." And then there's a quote from another municipality, Municipality B in our area, that says, basically they remove debris and sandbars to prevent obstructions in the river, but if it does hit you, you just have to deal with it. The city has a big, huge stockpile of sandbags. So I think you can get a sense from these 2 quotes, like how much Municipality A is really like investing, they're preventing people from living in particular places and so on, whereas the other city is saying, hey, we have sandbags, we just have to deal with it. And I think this is realistic, basically, in encapsulating the range of reactions that different municipalities have. So we did find quite a different levels of how many actions cities take, even despite similar exposure to these different risks. So the big question, okay, we got this different actions. We looked at things like financial. That's your first question. You say, well, do some cities have a lot more money? You know, they can deal with this better because they have a lot more money. Or are some cities really more educated? They have a lot more access to knowledge. Maybe they have a university town, something like that. No, I mean, we did the statistics. We looked at those. That was not an explanatory reason why people took more action. Obviously, money matters, but that was not what could account for this. So then we said, well, why is this? So we had 4 different hypotheses. And when I was saying earlier that I really draw on the literature from natural hazards, these are hypotheses that have come out of previous work studying how cities respond to things like floods and droughts in the past. So the first one is this champion hypothesis, and I think I saw this in one of the answers to the questions just now in the breakout area. You know, is there a champion? A champion at a city can really push forward and advocate for planning, and you'll see more prevention and preventative measures in that city. Hypothesis 2 is about external incentives. If you get extra money or you get required to make a plan, you get required to do some action, that's going to make you more likely to. Hypothesis 3 is about you've experienced an extreme event. So maybe you had a flood recently, or your neighboring town had a flood recently. People have direct experience with these things. We'd expect them to perhaps act. And the fourth is about perceived risk and risk perception. We talked a little bit about this earlier. So cities where the officials really perceive that there's a high risk to their city will be more likely to do these measures. Okay, so now I'll walk through what we found in each of these areas just really briefly. The first one about policy champions. Certainly in our cases, remember I mentioned we had those 6 case studies, our cases definitely spoke to the value of trust and passion and these individuals who are clearly champions in the community bringing things forward. One quote here, just one of those unusual guys willing to give a lot of his own time to try to make the world a better place. These champions are essential in a lot of places. However, when we looked across the quantitative results, it didn't come out as an explanatory variable for causing a lot of these extra actions to happen necessarily. It only kind of like worked when you included some of these other hypotheses that we'll talk about later. Not to say they aren't important, but our data, when we looked across the whole thing, said that that's not really enough by itself. External incentives. This was our second hypothesis about saying, you know, things outside of the realm of the town itself, like having grant funding be available, or having a state that's requiring something, or FEMA, for example, requiring plans to be filed in order to get some sort of extra, like different flood insurance rate and so forth. This was the only driver we looked at that was consistently significant across all 60 cities. This is a really important driver for causing proactive action on taking action on mitigating hazards and taking action on different kinds of risks. So these external incentives were really, really important in what we looked at. This is just some interview quotes from our cases. You know, we go to the state and ask for funding all the time. We apply to FEMA. We've applied to DHS mitigation, DEQ, EPA. We leverage our dollars. Or this is last quote about there's pressure from the county to get this done. This is like we all do, right? If somebody's giving us a hard time or pressure or deadline, we're more likely to take action. All right, so hypothesis 3, we looked at this one too, which was about extreme events. This was, again, we did not find that this was enough by itself to promote action. Also, though, in combination with these other factors, external incentives, presence of champion, risk perception, that together could contribute to taking action. Sorry, dry here in Colorado. Okay, and this is a nice interview quote from one of our cases about, in the aftermath of the flooding, the community was supportive of funding improvements, a number of improvements that have been taken on since, like flood control basins. We had these high run-up years, but it was a non-event because we'd already done something and the community had really supported that. So there is some role for this, but again, it's not like one of the main drivers that we found. Okay, our last hypothesis was about perceived risk, and again, we talked about a little bit this in the panel already, and managers did say they make choices on these perceptions of risk. They are shaped by experiencing events, But this was an interaction effect, basically. So perception of risk was positively associated with hazard action when we tested that by itself, and it also was significant in combination. But it was not as strong a driver as these external incentives, but it was an important driver that people perceived a risk. And I just wanted to show you an interesting thing we found, which makes intuitive sense. But when we tested it out, this is a little bit of a complicated figure. The solid line that's going up like this, that has a slope to it, is basically cities that did not have this external support, this external pressure or funding. The dashed line that's just basically horizontal is ones where they did have external support. And external support really matters less in cities where officials perceive this risk as higher, which makes sense. If you think there's a real risk to your town, you're going to try to do something. Whereas, if you get some extra money, you don't really think the risk is that bad, but there's this extra money on the table, then that might actually promote things. But really, the risk really matters when you don't, where you have this higher risk, the external support matters a little bit less. So the point being of this is there's interactions between these different factors leading to people to take action. So takeaway findings are really one of the biggest strong drivers is this external requirement to do these actions or this planning, or this availability of external funding. Those were clearly strong across the 60 cities that we looked at. Perception of risk also matters, but especially when there isn't this external funding. Champions and experiencing a previous event were likely to be acting in combination with these. We didn't see this being statistically significant as something that could work only by itself. I mean, I think this makes sense as well for us, because you think if you're a champion but you don't have the money or don't have the support of your town council, these kinds of things, champions can still be not able to carry forward on actions. I also want to point out at this point our limitations of our study. There were ways we could have done this that would have even been able to tease out action by action what drove this action or that action specifically. We did some binning of things and so on, and we could do a more careful study in the end of teasing these out. So I want to say there are some limitations to the conclusions that we made here, but those are all detailed too in the paper, so if you want to dig into those, you can. I think the broader conclusions to say about this research are that this idea that local communities are going to be able to sort of go it alone and implement adaptation actions by themselves is unrealistic. This finding comes from this need for this external funding or these external requirements that help communities take action. Funding and resources really matter, and there's I didn't mention this too much, and it's changing as Bill said every day, but basically there's been a constant finding in the literature that communities do a lot of planning. We do a lot of planning, lots of plans on the table, but when you look at implementation and actually starting to implement those plans, there's a lot less implementation going on. So there's this lag, and I think these things are really explanatory for why there might be such a lag. But what we want to be thinking about is what conditions are there on the ground that really act to create this enabling environment. So, if you don't have a champion, but maybe you have perception of risk there, you have access to external funding from somewhere else that's causing you to move forward. Maybe you've experienced an event and these things come together as producing an enabling environment that helps you move forward. So that's the sort of nutshell of our study out here. I want to thank again our collaborators on this paper. We were funded by the NOAA RESA program. Thank you to them for our funding. My email's here for anybody with questions, and I wanted to point out this paper here that really goes over this in great detail, probably more detail than you want to see. But if you don't have access to this paper through a library or such, you can email me for a copy of this PDF too, or I'm sure the organizers are happy to send that out. I'm happy to share the PDF. So with that, I'll just take questions, or I think Franco's going to be hosting that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was phenomenal. What I want to do now is ask you a few questions, but first I want to invite Bill and Chelsea to turn on their cameras and join us for the discussion. And I'll summarize for you, just as they're joining us. You got a series of questions about people wanting to know more about your voters, the income, education, demographic, the social conditions, So on the one hand, you got sort of a group of questions, people wanting to know more, for example, focusing on those municipal A, municipality B, their sort of socio-demographics. On the other hand, Alavi pitched a question about, well, you've got these exogenous factors like the low cost of oil right now. And so how does that factor in? How do global factors influence what you're seeing on the ground? And is there any chance that, since you can't control those things at the local scale, is there any chance that, I guess the strength of those is determinants of action. So maybe you could sort of talk a little bit about the socio-demographics and then scale out and talk about how global affects local.
Yeah, sure, and that's great. Those are great questions. And I mean, one of our first things going into this study was to think, okay, the wealthier towns are going to be more likely to have actions, for example, or the towns like, say, Boulder, for example, that has a university and a natural hazard center and all this knowledge and so forth there, is going to be likely to have more actions. But when you control for these things, it actually turned out that the demographics, socio-demographics, was not explanatory for why communities take action. One of the things that we couldn't test with our data, like the way that we had collected our data, but I'm very interested in testing in the future, is things that are a little bit more intangible, like I mentioned in my previous comments about culture and acceptance of government activity or restrictions on zoning, things like that. There is a big difference out here in the West anyway about how communities look at things like zoning and whether they put some areas off limits for development or not. And those things, I think, those kinds of worldviews or cultural views about whether the government or the local government can restrict actions, I think, are going to be pretty important for explaining, again, like what kinds of actions get taken and how many and so forth. And whether you have the sandbag or you have, like, complete differences in zoning. On your second question about, oh yeah, sure, global conditions and so forth can be swamping, right, of any local response, and that's partially what I'm trying to say. Although we didn't study the climate mitigate, the energy side of this question, I do think what's interesting though is that there are things that a community can control in the adaptation space, and I'll just give out a couple of examples. We did some workshops in the western slope of Colorado with smaller towns, and we presented data. They were going through a terrible drought at the time, and we were saying, look, this is indicative of the kinds of conditions. These are probably going to become more frequent given what we know about the climate system and so on. And they were, right then and there, they were like, wow, now is the time to look into how we build this extra pipe to connect to the water rights we have in this reservoir over here. Like, it's now. Let's put that in the budget for October. It sort of like became, there are things, there are bigger picture things, like people worry a lot in our region and the Western Slope, for example, about the Colorado Compact. There's this huge legal document that governs water allocation that was set up 100 years ago. So that's something you cannot control at your small scale. But things that you can control and that you have some access to seem to be the way to go. But I totally agree with the premise, which is there are things that swamp what you can control at the local level.
Bill, Chelsea, you want to add anything to that? Oh, Bill, we can't hear you. You got to activate your mic.
Apologize. I have a question for Lisa, if that's okay. Sure. That sort of picks up on the points. So, great presentation. It's just like it's so much fun to hear it. One of the things that's challenging in the literature is this idea of accelerating adaptation. So if you're thinking about your hypotheses and the results and sort of through that, like enabling conditions, was anything revealed to you with respect to like where are opportunities to accelerate? Is it like, obviously more, I assume like more funding certainly will do some, but there's a diminishing return kind of element to that as well potentially. So where, did you have any sort of thoughts on like where are the levers to accelerate adaptation from the research?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think you hit on one idea, which is like making sure it fits in with people's quality of life, idea, like the things that are priorities anyway. I do think there's an opportunity to accelerate adaptation. I mean, looking at the Rockefeller Resilience, officers' experience, at least from some of the cities I've talked to, there's a gap between having a person with like a knowledge and a plan and so forth versus having that money, to be able to take some actions early on. And so one of the things I think would accelerate funding is true, but it's true, it's hard to do, I guess I should say. But I do think that having grants out there, having things that a city can apply to that move them down the road and get things actually, they tend to snowball and people can move forward on it. I just think that the budget conditions at the local level are so kind of controlling in a way that that would be the biggest thing, I would think. But other things, I think champions, even though, like I said, it didn't really come out statistically, it was present in every city. There were everybody that talked about, like, this person. I mean, you just could hear it in the different interviews in our cases. This person was critical. This person was critical. Mm-hmm. And that is partially how our democracy, how we overcome this inertia of democracy you talked about, where there's a person who's like got their eye on the ball on flood risk all the time. Right. 20 years they show up to city councils and they get that in front of people. So I don't know that there's any way to short circuit it better than that. It really is a matter of people seeing it as a priority, putting money and time and people on it. And also, I think, like you said, linking it with stuff that matters to them, that quality of life, and like being willing to take on the flood risk mitigation as opposed to a new library. Like our town, it's all about like, we want a new library. No, we have to do, like library police, those things are just ever present. So seeing how those things are connected is really important.
Chelsea, you want to add anything?
I had sort of a similar thought, which was I was wondering, as you were talking about sort of risk perception and local champions, whether maybe with the risk perception one more, whether you were seeing sort of an opportunity there for like peer-to-peer learning as kind of an enabler of acceleration. So kind of similar to what Bill was asking, but I was wondering if you guys have thought about ways that you could leverage what does exist in those places, whether it's the local champion or whether it's risk perception, and what might work for some of those versus others.
Yeah, I think that's another great point. Like, well, and I see some of the folks on the call like are from the water sector, and I study the water sector a lot, and that is a place where peer-to-peer learning is really, it does accelerate, actually. There's these key nodes in networks, these key people, actually, that others call and say, hey, what do you think about this new forecast that's been put out, or this new product, or this new thing? Is this a good thing? Should I use it? Should I not? That peer-to-peer connection is just rapid, and they're trusted. They're trusted places in the network. So my sense is if there are tools and techniques and things that would help people move along the adaptation spectrum, connecting up with those key nodes, those key people, helps to accelerate and then spread that out to the peer network. And again, in a real way, like so that it's not like, so people have to test these things out, and actually there is somebody taking that early adopter sort of risk, if you will, of using something new or moving along the adaptation spectrum. And I've got cases in the Western Slope where people have even tried new things and then it didn't work. Like, for example, I mean, this is a small example, but water conservation, like days when you couldn't water your lawn type of thing, right? Like, it's a drought, we're going to just water on a few days and stuff. And it ended up increasing the water use. It ended up that the town, it didn't work for them to actually save water, and the citizens had all these problems, and they like complain and so forth. And they were like, we are never using that again. So sometimes what works for other communities doesn't work for particular reasons, and you have to also know your political base. I mean, your base in your town and what they're willing to go with and not, and be very careful. I mean, my other example is, in a drought situation, one town decided to ban being able to fill up your bird bath, like that you couldn't fill up your bird bath in your backyard, which is like a minuscule amount of water, but like it just got everyone out of the woodwork who is a bird lover and a bird watcher, and they were like, banging on city hall doors, and if you think like policy-wise, that's just, yeah, that probably is not the best policy to do. But like, how do we share those stories more so that people don't go through the negative experiences and they say, oh yeah, what's my community about? They're not going to go for that, or that didn't really work anyway. Those are the peer-to-peer learning is really important.
So Lisa, your statement that it's unrealistic to expect communities to go it alone inspired two questions from Amy and Joe. Amy was wondering if that's true, if there are regional councils of governments, for example, who can sort of make up the difference there and promote collaboration. And Joe was asking if whether there's sort of a history of collaborative engagement changes that conclusion. In other words, if there have been successful ways that people have worked together, perhaps on other issues in the past, does that change this? And I would just add to that, is this unique to climate change, do you think? Or, are communities that, their willingness to go it alone or not, is that unique to this particular challenge?
Oh, I think it's not unique at all, and I have a couple examples of this. These are great questions, and I do think area collaboration and councils of governments and so forth can be very effective. There's a couple examples again from the water sector where regional councils, I forget the name of it, but they banded together different water systems in a particular area, and when there was a drought, they had a coordinated message and a coordinated approach and they had decided on that before a drought had occurred, so that the trigger basically allowed, say, okay, it's time for us to declare a drought. It allowed some political cover in a way for people to act together in the best interest of the whole community, but to not be sort of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to go through city council right now at this particular time, and it might be controversial, and we might not be able to enact. So there was a sort of, so I do think these collaborative bodies are very important. There's another example in Florida where they had this kind of race to the bottom of just drawing so much groundwater out that it was really destroying the environment. But somebody, again, a champion this time, back in the 80s, brought the communities together, and they agreed on a water plan and a pricing structure and a delivery system for water that has lasted for quite a long time and has been successful, and it raised the price of water, but everyone was in it together, and it ensured a constant delivery. So there was a benefit to the coordination and an agreement, and there was a champion in that case that really brought everyone together, and they had a driving factor of why they couldn't, what the problem was as well in the beginning. So, and then I think you were asking about a history of this. Yes, I mean, I think people look back on that kind of story. I heard that story over and over again about that particular time, that person. Those kind of legends are very important for, the narrative about that, right? For showing how this works and how the coordination happened, to give hope to people who are putting together a plan for right now, trying to coordinate, make new coordinating groups. So I do think those are helpful. Definitely.
Bill, have you found the same, just to sort of geographically spread it out, that the sort of regional partnerships or collaborations or histories or places, I'm thinking of places in the Bronx, for example, where there's been, a long history of collaboration on different environmental and social issues. Is that playing itself out in the climate world as well?
It's a great question. I think, the big problem in the New York metro region, of course, there's like the 800-pound gorilla, the city of New York, and then all these other municipalities. So there's been ambitions, at the regional scale, and, to create sort of more of a regional coherence. I think you see more of that in the Philadelphia area, certainly with some of the long-standing regional kind of collaborations in Baltimore to some extent, but also Boston. So it is, specific to the city of New York and the metro region, it's one of those classic kind of, holy grails. It's 3 states, it's thousands of municipalities, linking them together is kind of complicated. Drilling down a little bit into the city of New York, the city, one of the problems is that, of course, there's all these sort of bureaucratic overlays, which I mentioned. There's, the city of New York, the state of New York, the feds are sort of, involved as well. They have jurisdiction on different kinds of environmental questions, and of course within the City of New York you have the City Council, which has a different geography than the community boards. The community boards are relatively weak. So it's, there is this sort of, overlaying and oftentimes conflicting kind of administrative, at least at the formal governance level. In terms of the informal, you mentioned community groups and so forth. I think one of the challenges that's come up is that while different communities, like every community has, in many cases, an environmental-oriented community organization, a community-based organization, but then there are these sort of larger ones, particularly looking at kind of EJ questions, environmental justice, and they oftentimes, while they kind of collaborate with others, there's also kind of a turf quality that they cover different parts of the city, and there's a challenge, a competition for resources. So there's always an ambition for collaboration, but there's always things, in the way, either sort of formal or lack of kind of formal kind of agreements or competition over resources. So it's, there's more work to be done, shall we say. But that's, and the progress is...
Lisa, is there any evidence that the age of the town, how long ago it was incorporated, has any impact on I guess, certainly their likelihood of acting on climate, but maybe even other, working together in other ways?
That's a great question. I was just scanning that. I don't think we looked at that, so we could look at that pretty easily, actually, just to see when they incorporated. I mean, there's so many different levels, or I guess layers to why somebody has risk. Like we have towns in our region around Denver, for example, that are very new towns, and they have a very high risk level for water, for drought, because they don't have senior water rights. But that's such a specific situation for that particular hazard, that hazard of drought. But it's a great question. I mean, we could really try to tease that out easily by, like, say, incorporation date or something. We didn't do that. Thanks.
I'm going to read a question from Lewis that just popped up. So this is to Lisa. Don't you feel that during a real emergency, the governmental people responsible for disaster implementation cannot wait for community acceptance? This is assuming that they have the authority to act built into their charters. I guess it's tied to this question of sort of the governance structure. The previous one was sort of governance history. This is more the structure.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I bet you're tipping your hand that you are one of these folks. But I think that's right. And in fact, I mean, like I know most about drought, and many managers tell me that basically they want to have these things in place, like drought trigger plans, plans for drought, triggers, so forth, so they don't have to wait for the political body of whatever city to enact what's needed to protect the water supply, for the long run. So I would agree that the way to kind of combine the democratic part of it and the the need to act quickly in an emergency is to do your plan when it's not an emergency. Like work out what you would do when you're calm and collected and everyone can debate and see what would be fair and so on. But so that gives the freedom for the emergency manager to act at that time. Obviously, that's not always possible. But I mean, even in wildfire management, for example, we have a coordinated response body laid out, and you have to have a system of who's in charge then of that body. There's all these different entities, all these jurisdictions involved in fighting a large fire at the urban, wildland-urban interface. But there's one person who's the coordinator for that, and you have to have that. It's not a democracy at that point. It's like we have to act and make decisions about how this is fought and how we get people out safely and where we're, evacuation orders, that sort of thing. So I tend to obviously feel like that is not the time for a big poll of the residents about what to do, but that's where the planning comes in at a time when you're not actually in that emergency situation.
We have about 10 minutes left. We've got to still have a few more questions. I want to save Mitra's question for sort of maybe closing comments by our three panelists. In other words, if she's asking about public participation, So how do we facilitate, how do we expand the number of people who, in that spirit of democracy are part of this process and part of coming up with the strategies? Because, of course, the more palatable the strategies are, in other words, the greater number of people who kind of are behind them, the more galvanizing they are, the more likely they are to succeed. So I was going to kind of put that there, although as just in your head as a closing statement. But first, let's just get to Dawn's comment. How important is project success? So, Joe was talking about the history of collaborating on other things. But success is sort of like if we work together and we've done something good, we start to trust each other, and then that makes us want to collaborate on new risks, including climate. So I don't know. I just put that out there first, and then maybe we can kind of spend the last 6 minutes or so with 2 minutes from each of you, sort of closing statements on public participation.
Sure. I'll just go really quick on the issue of acceptance and trust. I think you're absolutely right. Trust takes a long time to build, and it's an excellent resource to be using for the future. But it's also breaks in a second too. It's an asymmetrical resource. It takes a long time to build, and it can break very quickly. So I think that that is, though, if you have a working relationship, you've got trust because you've delivered, you've been honest with people, and so on. That is a great foundation to build from, and that gets mentioned quite a lot in in empowering people, whether they can act or not. So I would say yes to that. And maybe Bill should talk about this too as well from his work.
Bill, do you want to add anything?
In terms of the issue of success and trust, yeah, it's I would disagree. I mean, it's so easy to lose, again, this whole idea of connecting. I mean, yes, that's a kind of a nice metric, but a metric of success. Unfortunately, success is seen and has to be sort of interpreted by many people. So a lot of people don't necessarily, people who are funders or people who are sort of, managing, projects upstream, building of trust is to them not as meaningful as other sort of metrics. So it's always that challenge of like what's that trans.
And it sort of gets into a question that I had for you earlier, Bill, and when you were presenting the Azoni work that had at the end the sort of sustainability. There was, I think, an arrow pointing to how climate adaptation should, at least keep sustainability metrics where they are, if not improve things. But the whole premise of that was starting with we need climate action, and then sustainability is sort of, sort of something that comes out of that or not. But I wonder this trust question, whether, this ties into the public participation thought, is that, whether we should be starting in climate adaptation by trying to build up sustainability. And then, if people need things done, they've needed things done even before climate change, and those things weren't done, and that's why there's a lack of trust in certain places. And so, you can come in and start talking to them about something else, but, if we can build trust on, on some of the sort of 10,000-pound gorillas in the room in terms of, environmental justice, for example, other issues, then along with that progress, you're meeting people where they are. Climate action becomes sort of a logical next step in that process. I mean, that's I'm sort of a statement, but a question to all of you. But maybe we have 5 minutes left. Maybe you can all, maybe starting with Chelsea, we can just sort of go round robin and kind of talk about that or anything else to just kind of close it out.
Sure. Yeah, I like the question about building of trust as a success measure. We think about that a lot in our program. I don't think we formally measure it yet as such, but to us that's a really important metric of success, actually. So I guess to the question about participation, how to sort of engage more people and maybe more diverse people in this conversation, as funders, one of the reasons we provide long-term funding is to try to enable that so that there's sufficient time to work with communities. If a community doesn't really want to have the conversation at a particular time, you can wait 2 years and your funding is still there to have that conversation when, a drought occurs or an extreme event occurs that maybe makes that conversation more palatable. Another, I think, thing that we think about as a funder in that space is sort of the power of connecting and networking. So one of the RISAs, the RISA that covers the Great Lakes, has actually studied this and has a lot of papers out about something they call the boundary chain approach, where as a boundary organization, which most RISAs think of themselves as, they then connect to other boundary organizations which have their own networks of people who then connect to other boundary organizations who have their networks. And so through that kind of, you're opening up to a lot of people that may not be able to come directly to you but have trusted relationships with your partners. And then the last thing I would quickly say is we've piloted a position in a number of RISA teams, which is sort of interesting on this question. It's sometimes called a climate assessment specialist, sometimes called a sustained assessment specialist, and they, because they've been full-time people out in the regions, have actually been able to engage with a lot of additional partners that maybe would not have been engaged by NOAA necessarily or by the RISA. And they, in particular, have helped to link people with the national climate assessment process, but I think a position like that could be linked to other things in the climate.
And speaking of the RISAs, we're very thankful for your giving us the ability to build that trust. It's really important in our work to be able to be around for a while. Lisa, should we go over to you?
Yeah, sure. Just really quickly, I think public participation, the one way to do that is that well, I'll just say an example for drought, and basically constant communication about, for example, the value of water, even when you're not in a drought, really lays the groundwork for then people to trust and to be willing to go along with restrictions during a drought. So this is a job that you build up over time. You don't just try to do it in the moment of an extreme event. You have to be communicating with people, engaging people on the issue, building that shared understanding of what the issue is, and then at the moment when you need people to actually coordinate and come together around something, you have that capital there, that public support there. So I just think that is like one of the lessons as well, is that we have to be thinking about how to maintain this engagement with the public all the time, even when it's not a drought or it's not some kind of emergency.
So true, thanks. Bill, you get the last word, I guess.
Yeah, well, actually, Lisa just took my last words, but I mean, it's so straight on. I mean, this idea of just continuing engagement. I mean, I think one of the challenges that we see, I mean, this is sort of a broader argument, but, a lot of the risk and hazard, one of the Achilles heel of a lot of risk and hazards literature is that its framing has always, as it emerged initially, was kind of this, that the public was this sort of homogeneous thing. And I think one of the things that we've realized, over the last couple of decades specifically, is that there are multiple publics, and in some cases, it's obviously all these things, income levels, sort of, all the kind of standard kind of metrics that come up, and we recognize the strength of a very heterogeneous society, but I think at the same time, we hear COVID-related stories and like, why are some countries doing better than others? And this notion of like, oh, it's more homogeneous, you can sort of put policies in place, it's more, it's not as much income differentiation, et cetera. So I think what we need to do is to sort of think more, more and smarter ways about how to reach these sort of multiple publics. We do have multiple publics. In some cases, they've become increasingly divergent because of, income issues, which is a bigger question, but that's part of the struggle, that this work oftentimes bumps up against those bigger societal issues beyond the questions of risk and hazard. But, I think if we kind of develop those strategies. I mean, one of the things that they're doing in the city of New York that provides a little bit of a leveling playing field through these different publics is the development of participatory budgeting, where neighborhoods are getting small slices of money and they're coming together collaboratively as a community and trying to identify how they want to fund different projects. These are small chunks of money. In some cases, tens of thousands, other cases maybe up to a couple of million in a community. But it does allow, that participatory process to really be very much evident and present, and that in turn creates opportunity to link together that sort of top-down process. I saw in one of the chat questions about where's Robert Moses now. He's the ultimate of sort of top-down sort of urban planning. And of course, city governments don't operate that way, but still there's this sort of top-down. And I think if we build that bottom-up, we can get to that space where we have that level of trust as well as capacity at the local level to engage.
Thanks so much to Noah, to Carrie and Beth for handling all the logistics that made this whole thing work. Thanks to Lisa and Bill for amazing presentations, and Chelsea, thanks for all your oversight and guidance here. We're out of time. I'd like to, if you enjoyed this, please go to the CC Run website and look at any of our previous seminars, like I said, going back to 2014. And join us next month at the first Wednesday of every month, 4 p.m. Eastern. We'll have our next, it seems like it will be a virtual webinar, so please join us. So thanks again to all of you, and see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.